Welcome back to episode 2 of the pod for the Film Fanatic. If you missed last episode, that's okay. I'll give a brief rundown right off the bat of what this show is and what we're doing here. I won't do that every episode, but just in case you missed it, the pod for the Film Fanatic is the first podcast being presented by When the Pictures Got Bigger, which is most likely where you're watching this, right? And it's also being presented in part by the Now Playing Network, which is a network of a lot of great film podcasts. One of my favorite film podcasts is the Directors Club, where every episode the host and a revolving door of co-hosts there take a look at any famous film director's entire filmography. You know, they look at the entire filmography of Stanley Kubrick or Elaine May. And this episode that actually is kind of pertinent, because in today's episode we're going to be looking at the entire filmography, or at least a selected filmography, of Frank Perry. And so I thought, right off the bat, I would mention the Directors Club, because although the Directors Club doesn't have an episode on Frank Perry, they do have an episode on his most famous film. And that episode, to me, was kind of formative in me discovering this film for the first time. So I just want to say, if you missed the first episode, no worries. I'll go ahead and catch you up really quick. This is a show where I'm going to work my way through Danny Peary's Guide for the Film Fanatic, which is this 4,200, I specifically counted it, by the way, it's a 4,210 film journey. That's how many films are listed in this book that Perry recommends you see to become this ultimate guide for the film fanatic, right? And the idea behind this show is I'm going to be working my way through this guide with the help of some guests every now and then. And I'm really excited. Without spoiling episode 3, I'm going to have a guest for the first time. And so that's going to be a lot of fun. Bring definitely a different vibe to the show. But the idea is, in order to make this more manageable and to make it more exciting to listen to, I want each episode to kind of follow a different small subsection of Perry's book. And so that could be an actor, that could be a director, that could be a theme or a category, a country of origin, whatever, right? It could be a complete grab bag like last episode was. But I didn't know what I wanted to do for episode 2. I kind of thought, well, let me do a director, but a director that doesn't get very much love these days. And I was looking I have a hard copy of Perry's book, and I was looking for a name that I kept seeing repeated, and the one name that I saw 8 times was Frank Perry. And Frank Perry, if you didn't know him, he's this kind of, I hesitate to say, I mean, he's like kind of a minor film director from the 1960s and 70s and through the 80s. And even the 90s, but I just think he's this film director that certainly is not talked about in the same vein as kind of other directors who started right at the cusp of New Hollywood, right? Like the Spielbergs or the Coppolas, or even like Mike Nichols, right? And so Perry's just this super interesting director. He's clearly extremely liberal. A lot of his films are very counterculture. They touch on themes that were certainly taboo in the 50s. And he's got a lot of really interesting movies. He's got some popular studio films, which in some ways are my least favorite of his works. But then he's also got a lot of small independent films that are completely unlike anything you've seen before. He also, his partner was his wife, Eleanor Perry. And we've got to mention her because she co-wrote, she wrote 4 of these films. So we're going to be talking about 8 films today. She wrote 4 of them. And without getting too ahead of myself, I will say those are probably 4 of my favorites. So it's interesting because with Frank Perry, I kind of thought, okay, well, I'm gonna love this guy's films. I've heard so many great things about The Swimmer, and Last Summer. But without revealing too much, I actually didn't have that reaction totally to his body of work. I think he's a very interesting director that has, in some ways, more flaws than he does strengths. But we're going to be getting into all of that this episode because we have 8 films to talk about.
You're a lucky little girl and very expensive. It cost me a lot of favors.
Christina, darling, I'm going to make a perfect life for you.
So I want to start with Mommie Dearest because Mommie Dearest, in many ways, is Frank Perry's most famous film. If you're not familiar with Frank Perry, it's maybe the only film of his that you've seen because it is the only film of his that has really found its way into the larger culture. Certainly, Faye Dunaway's performance here has been talked about as one of the career-killing performances of an actress, and I'm going to get into that because I'm not sure if I agree with that. But if you don't know what Mommie Dearest is, it's a biopic. It's one of only 2 biopics we're going to be talking about today. But it's a biopic on the life of Joan Crawford, and more specifically, Joan Crawford's daughter, Christina Crawford. So I was familiar with the large strokes here. I knew that Joan Crawford had adopted some children, and I knew that these children claimed that they were abused by Crawford. And that's kind of what this film follows. It follows Christina Crawford from her being adopted through Joan Crawford's death and her kind of reclaiming her life in a lot of ways. And it's been heralded as a lot of things. It's a very intense movie because for a biopic, it makes, I mean, Joan Crawford, it was made 5 years after her death, and in a lot of ways, I consider it a splatter piece on Joan Crawford. I mean, certainly it is painting Joan Crawford as this truly horrible, unfit mother. There's a few scenes in this film, most famously the wire hanger scene, where I mean, Faye Dunaway just goes completely ballistic on her daughter.
No wire hangers!
Christina is the subject of verbal, physical, emotional abuse, emotional manipulation. I mean, it runs the gambit of all of these terrible, terrible things that a parent can do to their child, right? And at the time, it was considered really, kind of disingenuous. I actually do find that a lot of how it paints Joan Crawford is fairly simplistic. I mean, I'm a big fan of Joan Crawford, and I'm not here trying to argue that she was a good woman because a lot of what happened to Christina in what's depicted in the film probably did happen and probably was true, but at times it feels like this movie is almost more so kind of trying to play into Joan Crawford's biggest hits. It touches on a lot of the things that we see in Mildred Pierce, which was one of her most famous roles, and there's an axe scene which from what I could tell was kind of the filmmaker is trying to play on Straight Jacket, which is a film of Joan Crawford's where she uses an axe. And I don't know, to me it's just it seems like more than a biopic that has great intents, it's almost like a clip show of Joan Crawford's best moments seeping into her real life. And it's kind of this horror film where we see an aging actress struggling with the fact that her best days are behind her. So I don't know, a lot of what Danny Peary says about this film is that the film focuses less on Christina Crawford, and it should focus on Christina Crawford because ultimately that's the person who wrote the story that the film is based on. And this film has like 5 or 6 screenwriters, by the way, which is never a good sign. But it doesn't really focus on Christina. It focuses a lot on Joan, and it shows kind of how hard it was to be an aging woman in Hollywood because a lot of women, Joan Crawford included, were cast in their 20s as the love interest, right? Or as the beautiful leading lady, right? And when you become 40 and you have children, you struggle to get roles of that same caliber and of that same, prestige, right? So it's this kind of very messy, misguided movie in a lot of ways. And the reason why I think it was an interesting place to start for your Frank Perry journey is because I think it shows a lot of Frank Perry's themes, but it also shows a lot of his issues. And I think one of the things about Frank Perry is he is a messy filmmaker. Not almost every single one of these movies I'm going to be talking about today has some aspects that I find are messy. And with Mommie Dearest, it's all over the place. It's a series of vignettes of Joan Crawford's life. We often jump time, and it's kind of unsure how far we're jumping ahead. The famous wire hanger scene, we jump immediately from that to Christmas, and Joan Crawford is delivering a radio broadcast with Christina, thanking fans all over the world who had sent her daughter toys for Christmas. And it's all over the place, and ultimately I can't say I really connected with it. But I think it shows a lot of what Frank Perry does well, in that he takes these swings. I'm calling him messy, but at the very least he's an interesting filmmaker, and I'm sure that's why Danny Peary included 8 of his films in this book. I want to pivot now to the other film in this double feature, because the other film, The Swimmer, is actually his best work.
Well, I've got to be on my way. I'm swimming home.
You're swimming home?
I figured out there's a river of pools all the way to my house.
Crazy idea.
I think it's a brilliant idea. Well, what are you doing it for? Why do you want to do it? I think it's very original. I mean, I think it's an adventure.
Come with me.
So The Swimmer is a film that I was very intimately familiar with. In a lot of ways, it's his other most famous film, but it's a famous film kind of to the art house crowd. I don't think it's really super famous among, casual movie audiences. So The Swimmer, the general premise here is that Burt Lancaster is this, he's an ad executive who, he lives this very rich life, and he decides that he wants to swim from their house through 2 miles of swimming pools towards his house. And he's kind of figured out that if you look at it from a certain way, there is a straight shot of swimming pools from his house, his backyard, to the current backyard that he's in. And all he has to do is travel through some forests and travel through the community pool, and then travel through about 6 or 7 other pools of people that he's friends with, neighbors, friends of his family. One of the pools is a girl who used to babysit for him. And it's really interesting because that plot on its own is somewhat fascinating. I mean, it's kind of like, okay, that's kind of cool. I want to see where that goes. But this movie gets this insane mileage out of it, because the film is like 90 minutes, and you wouldn't think they could get 90 minutes out of that plot, because either he can do it or he can't, right? Either he can swim, and you wonder, okay, what's the obstacle here? How is that going to be difficult at all to swim from one pool to the other? Because all he has to do is he swims the length of the pool. That's it. He gets out. He walks to the next house, and then he swims the length of that pool, and so on and so forth. But the really interesting thing about this film, and why I loved this movie, is that essentially each pool that he goes into, he has a run-in with the family that owns that home, and each one gets progressively more and more outlandish, right? So at first, he's swimming, and he gets interrupted, and he has this very pleasant conversation with the owners of that home, right? And after that, it gets a little more interesting, because he ends up swimming on a house where the family that is there, they think that he owes them money, and then as we get further, we go to a home where they're holding a party, and he wasn't invited to the party. And eventually we keep going, and I'm not going to spoil kind of what happens at each home, but each home is fascinating in its own way. And this movie really plays with the idea of an unreliable narrator, because we see this film's told through Burt Lancaster's point of view, and we see everyone loves this guy. He's kind of this hero of this town, and at one point he goes into the home of his former babysitter, the girl that he had hired to babysit his children, and she says that she had this huge crush on him, and it's kind of this weird thing where it's like, the movie almost plays with like the average like suffocating middle-class man who provides for his family's fantasy. I mean, it really plays into that kind of 1950s suburban businessman fantasy, and it really deconstructs it, because what we see in the beginning as these positives, this man is well loved, this man is he can have affairs with anyone he chooses, he sees that as huge positives to his life. We actually see how those are huge glaring negatives, and the most, like, the climax of this film takes place in the community pool, which is the pool that all of the people that don't have what he has are swimming, and it's 150 times more crowded than these nice, pristine backyard mansion pools. And he has to kind of swim with the middle class. And I'm not going to spoil the larger or the smaller details of this film, but I had heard about this film for years, and to be honest, this was the movie that really was the reason why I wanted to do this Frank Perry retrospective, because The Swimmer is seen today as this like really scathing look at suburbia and that kind of middle class 1950s lifestyle, and I think it's one of the best to ever do it. I mean, Burt Lancaster carries this movie, and this is why I think Frank Perry's interesting, because I think without a doubt the reason this movie is so good is not Frank Perry, it is completely Burt Lancaster. And interestingly, Burt Lancaster and Frank Perry did not get along. They did not like each other at all. And I think that kind of adds this little interesting take to it, where you can kind of tell that Burt Lancaster is just being completely buried, storyline wise. But yeah, if you've never seen The Swimmer, I think it's totally worth checking it out, especially as a double feature with Mommie, Dearest, because both of these films are these really scathing looks at someone who on the outside has it all. So that would be a great place to start. But I want to pivot now completely to the other theme that I think that Frank Perry does really, really well. And these two films are actually both written by Eleanor Perry. And you could argue that this is Eleanor Perry's kind of calling card theme. And that would be the theme of the marginalized groups of society in a film completely looking at those marginalized groups. And so the two films that we're going to be talking about here would be David and Lisa and Last Summer.
You fool, you touched me! You want to kill me? You fool, you want to kill me?
So let's start with David and Lisa, which was, I believe it's the earliest film that we're talking about in this entire marathon. A lot of his films were shot and released in the 60s and 70s. David and Lisa is 1962, so it is the earliest film we're going to be talking about here, and in a lot of ways it's his most amateurish. It's clearly the smallest budget of every film here, and it has a lot of its issues. But David and Lisa's plot is maybe the most interesting of all of these plots. The idea here is that it follows David, who is this teenager who's he kind of reminded me a bit of like Sheldon Cooper from Big Bang Theory, this kind of guy who thinks he's smarter than everyone else in the room, but he is hysterical. Like he essentially thinks that if anyone touches him, he's gonna die, right? He's like terrified. He's got this intense phobia of being touched by other people, right? And so he's committed to this insane asylum, right? This mental institution. And there he kind of takes on the role of psychiatrist, armchair psychiatrist, and he's constantly diagnosing the other people in this clinic. And he really hates them all. He thinks he's above all of them, until he meets Lisa, who is this she's like 15 years old, and Lisa is she suffers from multiple personality disorder. And she's got two major personalities. The first is this woman who can only speak in rhymes, and then the other is a mute, so she can't speak at all. So when Lisa's talking, she can only speak in rhymes, or she's not talking, right? And David, instead of diagnosing her and kind of thinking he's above her, really becomes fascinated with her. And in a lot of ways, this is a romance film, actually, because the two really start to care for one another. But it's not, it's not your conventional romance film, and it's arguable if it even is a romantic relationship, or if it's kind of one of the great films that focuses on a platonic friendship between two people, of the opposite sex, right? And this movie to me was another one that I've been meaning to watch for years, just because I love that plot, and I think that's one of the things that Frank Perry's films really appealed to me. Just these fascinating plots. But like the next film, Last Summer, this is a really empowering look at marginalized groups of society, right? So this is a film that completely gets into the head of a home for the mentally disturbed, youth. And instead of kind of making fun of them, and instead of, showing them as people that can't assimilate into regular society. The film kind of depicts them very sympathetically, very tenderly. There's one scene near the end of this movie where we see Lisa really connect with this statue, this art piece, and it's very reminiscent of Ferris Bueller's Day Off, where Cameron is really taken whenever they go to the Chicago Museum of Art. And I just think, this film, it took me by surprise, because when you see a 1962 film touching on mental illness, this is 2 years after Psycho, you kind of expect the worst in a lot of ways. You kind of expect, okay, this is going to be pretty misguided. There might be some pretty outdated language here. But no, David and Lisa really takes this very sympathetic, very forward-thinking look on people in mental asylums, and it does it in a way that's very much ahead of what we still see today. Beyond that, I don't think David and Lisa is super interesting. I kind of think it's one of those films that is most worth watching for kind of this historical context. I mean, I think I have a film in my top 100 movies of all time, which is Shock Corridor. That's also kind of the same, that's a 1960s film as well, that also takes place in an insane asylum, and I think that film is much more effective than this one, and luckily that film is included in Danny Peary's book, so we'll be talking about it at some point. But I don't know, I think David and Lisa, it's interesting, it's surprising in a lot of ways, seeing how David and Lisa are portrayed. But I wish we got a bit more of Lisa. One of the issues with a lot of films in the 60s is that the male is the leading character, when Lisa in a lot of ways is much more interesting to me as a character, and I wish we got a bit more spent on her. She doesn't even really come into the film until partway through. It's told through David's perspective completely, and so I wish we got a bit more of Lisa. But I just thought David and Lisa was this really interesting look at a group that was so often completely ignored in Hollywood's early years. And I think this, in a lot of ways, is my favorite double feature, because I'm going to completely pivot to Last Summer now.
When Last Summer began, they were children. When it ended, they were something else.
Last Summer is it's the fourth film here that I had heard of. The last four that we're going to get into I had not heard of at all. But Last Summer is this really intense movie. So essentially there's these three young teenagers. I think they're teenagers. They might be 20, but very young people, let's say 18, 19. And they're on summer vacation, and they're vacationing on an island, Fire Island. And Fire Island, it's got beaches, it's got beach houses and restaurants and theaters. It's just kind of this idyllic summer town. And these three teenagers one day come across this dying seagull. And there's a girl and two guys, and the girl wants to take care of the seagull. The two guys think the seagull should be put out of its misery because it's dying, and at this point it's there's nothing they can do for it. But they decide to take care of the seagull, and that's kind of, in a way, that's kind of their meet cute. That's how these three teenagers meet, and very quickly they find out they have a lot in common. They're all very free spirited. They are leagues ahead of their stuffy parents. They both make fun of their parents. They make fun of their siblings. They're kind of horrible in a lot of ways. I mean, they're mean teenagers. They are very spoiled, rotten, and at one point, very early on into the film, they're just kind of taunting the seagull that they've protected. And a fourth girl, a young girl, comes up to them. She's probably 15 or 16. And she comes up to them and she says, "Hey, you guys are tormenting this little bird. Let it go," essentially. And from that point on, they kind of become obsessed with bullying this new addition to their crew, who they think is fat, and she's ugly, and she's got nothing going for her, and she's not the free spirit fun person that they are. And they start to torment this girl in a lot of ways. They make her think that she's a part of their crew. They learn her secrets, and it's really intense to watch because it's really troubling. And this is one of the films that I had heard of because I've heard it described as one of the more disturbing movies of all time, especially because the film's final scene, which I refuse to spoil the final scene here, but it is one of the most disturbing and distressing scenes I've ever seen in a movie. It's so insanely hard to watch, and it's shocking that the film would go this far, in my opinion. But I can't hate it in a lot of ways because, like David and Lisa, this is a film that looks at a marginalized people in society, which is the youth, the young 16, 17-year-olds that are on vacation, summer vacation, and the parents let them go unwatched. The parents assume their kids are having fun on the beach. Why would they need to see what their kids are doing? And like David and Lisa, it really takes a sympathetic look at these people that, David and Lisa, they deserve that sympathetic look, but this film takes a sympathetic look at people that I consider to be complete scum, and it's just like most of Frank Perry's films. It's messy. It's the pacing is strange. It's kind of like ethereal. Like a lot of the cinematography and the way it's shot is very dreamlike. And it's full of metaphors that, in my opinion, don't land, right? And I think that's just Frank Perry for you, because a lot of his films, they bear a lot of different marks, kind of a lot of different fingerprints. Obviously, Eleanor Perry has a strong fingerprint on the films that she wrote, and you can tell the type of person that she was, very liberal, very open-hearted. And then Frank Perry, his films bear kind of this distinct mark of being messy and all over the place. And then we're going to get to some other people later on who had their hands on his films, and they're completely different fingerprints. So his movies are really, they range the gambit. I mean, already we've talked about a biopic on Joan Crawford, a suburban nightmare with Burt Lancaster, this independent film about a mental institution, and this kind of horror film about 4 teenagers vacationing on an island together. And each film is completely different. Each film has its pros and cons. And other than The Swimmer, I can't say I really loved any of them. Because, I think Last Summer and David and Lisa and Mommie, Dearest are fascinating in their own ways, but they are partly misguided. They're partly conventionally shot. He doesn't have very many director flourishes, which I kind of like to see. That's one of the things I really look for in a great director is what is their signature move. That's the auteur theory. But if I were to say you should do any of these double features, I would actually recommend you do this next double feature, and that would be what I consider the Western double feature of Rancho Deluxe and Doc.
2 rustlers determined to hustle their share of Rancho Deluxe.
So let's start with Rancho Deluxe here. I mentioned that my favorite film of this batch of 8 was The Swimmer. But if you were to sit me down and say right now, which film do you most want to revisit already, it would undoubtedly be Rancho Deluxe. Rancho Deluxe, it's kind of, in a lot of ways, it's the one that I see myself remembering the best. It's the one that I see myself revisiting more often than any other. And in a lot of ways, it's the lightest on plot of any film we have here. So the essential story behind Rancho Deluxe is it takes place in Montana, and it follows 2 drifters who they make their living by stealing cattle, essentially. So they head on to these protected reserves, and they kill cattle, they sell it, they make their rent each month by selling, a single piece of meat, right? But it's contemporary, so it takes place in the 1970s, and that kind of way of life is no longer acceptable. These are, this was the way of life for cowboys for generations, but now in 1970s Montana, their landlady is saying, hey, I need money, you can't keep giving me meat. And a lot of these preserves, or the reserves where they're killing these cattle now is owned by, wealthy vacationers, right? And they're wanting, their land to be protected. And that's the general idea of the film, which is, we're following these two cowboys, and they're trying to avoid being caught doing this illegal activity of killing cattle. But in a lot of ways, that's kind of just the window dressing to what is a really beautiful look at contemporary Montana. And Montana has got to be one of my 5 or 6 states that I really love being depicted in film. I've been to Montana. It remains one of my favorite vacations my family ever took, because Montana is just this beautiful land of rivers and bears and mountains and huckleberry, and it's just, Rancho Deluxe is as great as any other film to show that state of Montana. The film stars Jeff Bridges. He's the white cowboy, and then his buddy is a Native American cowboy who is Sam Waterston. And like all of Frank Perry's other films, I gotta give him credit for completely showing Native Americans here very sympathetically. Sam Waterston is not a caricature of Native Americans, and he lives in a normal house with his family, and we touch on these sensitive themes of Native Americans feeling like their land has been stolen and having to assimilate into Western society, but it's done so in a way that is entirely sympathetic. And then the other thing that I really loved about this film is it's definitely a who's who of character actors. So Slim Pickens is in the film. He's one of the owners of the land that wants his wants these cowboys gone because they're stealing his cattle. And there's 2 hired hands who are essentially they're basically detectives sent to stop and apprehend and find these 2 cowboys, and one of them is Harry Dean Stanton, who we talked about in the last episode during Straight Time. And Harry Dean Stanton, in my opinion, is in my top 5 character actors of all time. I thought he was so great in everything, and if we can talk about a Harry Dean Stanton movie in every single episode, I will die a happy death, right? And this film, it was so great. I'm trying to avoid, I really want to expand my vocabulary as we talk about these movies, because I can't just say, oh, this was great, this was good, this was bad, especially because I don't give films star ratings. I don't really find that to be super effective. But Rancho Deluxe, in a lot of ways, it's kind of similar to Dazed and Confused or Fast Times at Ridgemont High, where it's this hangout movie. A lot happens, but there's always a series of scenes where you're kind of just hanging out with these characters, entering their world. We see, at one point we see one of my favorite scenes. We see Harry Dean Stanton and Jeff Bridges play Pong together, and this is 1975, so this is video games in its infancy. But they're both in an arcade, and Harry Dean Stanton approaches Jeff Bridges, who's playing Pong, and he, says, can I join you? Can I play with you? And the 2 of them are playing this game of Pong, and while they're doing that, Harry Dean Stanton is kind of toying with him and saying, hey, I know it's you that's stealing this cattle, and I'm going to apprehend you. I'm going to turn you into the authorities. And while they're having this conversation, it's very clear that both of these actors are just playing Pong, because they're reacting to what's happening in the game in real time. Harry Dean Stanton moves his arm and he loses a point, and then he curses because but at the same time he's trying to be this tough guy who's showing off to Jeff Bridges that he knows who he is, right? And of all of Frank Perry's films, I really found that his directing, like his photography, was very conventional. This is the only shot in all of his films that I thought was super, super interesting. And it's the Pong scene, and the entire scene is shot from inside the Pong machine. So we are inside the arcade machine, camera's facing out towards Bridges and Stanton, and we're watching these 2 have this conversation. We're watching them play the game from inside the machine with the arcade machine overlaid on top, and it's really hard to explain. If you're watching this on YouTube, I'll include kind of a clip of what it looks like, but it's just like, wow, that's such an inspired, cool shot. And it's kind of like, it's funny because there's this joke now, with our attention spans being shot, that a lot of people, a lot of kids need to be playing Subway Surfers while a movie's going on because they need to see a game while also seeing the action unfold. And this is kind of a prototype of that, because we're watching the Pong game while the scene is happening at the same time. And I don't know, it's just like, out of every single shot across all 8 of these films, that's the one that stuck with me more than anything. And I really was taken by this movie. So many scenes that we see a cattle auction, right? And I love cattle auctions in films because I love the way the auctioneers talk, and they're speaking a mile a minute. Slim Pickens is great. He's always the cowboy in films. He's the guy who rides the nuclear bomb in Doctor Strangelove, and he's got that very distinctive voice. And just, overall, this is a movie that I am already wanting to rewatch. There's a great Blu-ray of it out there, I think by Twilight Time. But for years, this film was very underseen, and actually, of all 8 of these films, I think this is his least popular, which is crazy because it's this complete hidden gem, and so far, it's the film that I'm most grateful to Danny Peary for discovering for me, because this wasn't even on my radar. Obviously I'd heard of The Swimmer, I had heard of Last Summer, I had heard of Mommie, Dearest, and I had been meaning to see them, but when I saw Rancho Deluxe in Perry's book, I didn't know what to think. I just saw directed by Frank Perry, and I said, okay, well, let me try and find this one. And the entire film is on YouTube, so if you're looking to watch it, it's accessible. It's not the greatest quality. It seems like it might be like a VHS rip, but I think I'm certainly talking about this film more than any other, because in a lot of ways the goal of this show is to expand people's horizons. I'm doing this 4,200 film journey, and I'm going to bring people along with me, but if you want to come along with me, I'm not going to ask you to watch 8 films every single episode, right? But if you're going to watch one film, I would say maybe make it Rancho Deluxe. Or if you're going to watch 2 films, do it in a double feature of Rancho Deluxe and this next film, which is completely different, and that would be Doc.
He gambled for a living and killed for a hobby.
So Doc is another Western. It's Frank Perry's one of 2 Westerns, and this one was not written by Eleanor Perry, and this was very similarly to Mommie, Dearest. This was a studio film that was big budget and starred a lot of famous actors, including Faye Dunaway, back from Mommie, Dearest. Actually, sorry, this is a decade before Mommie, Dearest. I'm just speaking of it in terms of the order which we're talking about them. But Mommie, Dearest is 1981 and Doc is 1971. So it's Faye Dunaway in her prime, right? A few years after Bonnie and Clyde. And Doc is a revisionist Western, which the revisionist history genre has been completely overtaken by Quentin Tarantino. He loves that genre, right? Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is a revisionist history film, but Doc kind of touches on this very famous Western story that we don't fully know all of the details of, and that would be the story of Doc Holliday and the gunfight at the OK Corral. And a lot of films have touched on this very famous gunfight. If you don't know, the very brief story of this kind of Western, might be myth, might be fact, that we don't fully know, is that there was, at a time in the Wild West, it was called the Wild West because it was lawless, right? A lot of these small Western towns, this takes place in Tombstone, Arizona, they had no laws, so there would be people constantly robbing banks and constantly, killing each other, fighting, shootouts in the street. And obviously, at a certain point, we had to become civilized, right? And so Tombstone, Arizona gets a new sheriff, and that's Wyatt Earp, right? And Wyatt Earp comes to the town, and he says he's going to finally bring law and order to this town. And Doc Holliday is Wyatt Earp's buddy, and Doc Holliday, he's there to help him, but both Earp and Holliday have to essentially fight for this town. And I think your mileage may vary on this one. It really depends on how you feel about Westerns, because Frank Perry always was this chameleon of genres. He never really found himself sticking to a single genre, but this is through and through a Western. And I'm surprised, actually, that Danny Peary included this in his book, because in a lot of ways, I think this film is entirely conventional, and in a lot of ways, very uninteresting. At least in the idea of it not being super unique and super counterculture of him, right? Like, all of Frank Perry's films that we talked about, every single one so far has been a film that in some way or another is different than what Hollywood was doing at large, right? And Doc is in many ways very much what Hollywood was doing in the 1970s, which is, these mid-budget films with a few famous actors, 90 to 110 minutes, a fun night at the theaters, film of the week, that sort of thing, right? And so, yeah, I'm surprised Frank Perry agreed to direct this. I'm surprised that Danny Peary felt it was worth including. I liked it in the way that I like 1970s films. I think 1970s American films are probably my favorite decade of American films, because there's something to the pacing. There's something to the fact that the Hays Code was over and people were really experimenting that I love. But if you're not super into 70s films, I mean, this is not anywhere near the top of the list, right? Again, like most of his films, it's very conventionally shot, very conventionally directed. There's no, experimental flourishes or anything like that. And in a lot of ways, it's certainly something that you could skip if you're just trying to get a taste of Frank Perry's works. But I thought it was fun. I love films that kind of play with what we know to be true. And especially one of the things that I think that Doc does so interesting is that we get the gunfight at the OK Corral, which has been immortalized in so many films. But unlike these other films, which kind of build up to it as this huge grand thing where who's going to survive, who's going to win, it's so low key, and it's almost like the film seems uninterested in the fact that has been so widely talked about. So many of these films, Wyatt Earp is the lead, right? We follow the Marshal, Wyatt Earp, but this film focuses on Doc Holliday, and it focuses on how he got to Tombstone, which is it's a unique perspective. And so I guess if I'm to say anything about Frank Perry's touch, it would be that, which is, again, he's looking at something through the lens that most people aren't looking at it through. So I appreciated that part. I also thought Stacy Keach was really good as Doc Holliday. He's a very famous character actor who's been in hundreds and hundreds of films and television shows. But here he is in the leading role. So that's another example of Frank Perry, kind of taking a look at something from a different perspective. So I just think this would be an interesting double feature. Both Doc and Rancho Deluxe were clearly shot on location. I love films that were shot on location, especially in states not called California or New York. Arizona and Montana are certainly less popular states in film, and so it's fun seeing kind of a different perspective in that way. So I think this would be a great double feature for you, and in a lot of ways this is the least demanding double feature of any of these, because neither of these films are difficult watches. They're breezy, they're quick, they're both short. I think they're both under 95 minutes probably. So yeah, I would say this would be a really fun Western double feature if you're in the middle of summer and you're looking to kind of feel like you're living your cowboy fantasy out. I don't know. But we've got one more double feature left, and in a lot of ways this is the most interesting double feature. I keep assigning a double feature some superlative, and maybe I don't need to. But these last two films are Frank Perry's two films that follow women. So obviously Mommie, Dearest follows Joan Crawford, and it follows a woman, but I would struggle to call that a feminist film, if only because I don't think that it's very sympathetic towards Joan Crawford. But these last two films both take a look at women through the perspective of women, and they are told completely sympathetically towards women. So these two films would be Diary of a Mad Housewife and Play It As It Lays.
Diary of a Mad Housewife, a Frank Perry film with screenplay by Eleanor Perry, from the novel by Sue Kaufman.
So let's start with Diary of a Mad Housewife. This is, I don't rank these films, and I'm not trying to rank these films, but I don't know. I don't want to say this is my favorite because, again, I've spoken so highly of the other ones. But I would just say Diary of a Mad Housewife is a really, really good film about this woman who is stuck in this terribly abusive relationship. Her husband is a lawyer, and he's arrogant, and he's abusive, and he criticizes. The film opens on the two of them waking up in the morning, and we follow how she settles him up for his day at work, because she's a housewife, she doesn't work, and so as soon as she gets up in the morning, he says, "Oh, you slept in, and oh, you're looking really skinny today. You should eat. And what happened to your hair? Your hair looks disgusting. It's so short. I don't know, you're not impressing me in any way." And she makes him breakfast, and he says, "Oh, these eggs are terrible. You call these, eggs?" And he ridicules her in front of their children. So the children start to kind of adopt that mindset where they call their mom, and they say, this breakfast is terrible, Mom. What did you do wrong this time? And so, I mean, this woman she just takes abuse and abuse and abuse and abuse, and it's hard to watch, like a lot of Frank Perry's films are, like Last Summer is, and she, as a way to kind of act out, and a way to kind of feel like she's regaining her anonymity back, she begins an affair with this writer who her husband loves, this writer, and she meets him at a party one day, and in a lot of ways he's just as awful. He's extremely arrogant, he's extremely misogynistic, he is openly telling her that he's having affairs with multiple other women, and that she shouldn't fall in love with him, and she's gonna fall in love with him because everybody falls in love with him. He's incredibly pretentious, the way he talks, it's kind of like, oh my goodness, dude, like, are you you're that full of yourself? And it's just, every single scene that she's in, and Carrie Snodgrass plays the housewife, which I have to give her credit, because she carries this film. I mean, if it weren't for Carrie Snodgrass, just like if it weren't for Burt Lancaster in The Swimmer, this film would be almost nothing. Frank Perry, a lot of his actors didn't have very many nice things to say about him, but he was very good at getting performances out of his actors. I have to give him that credit, because this film would not work if she doesn't play it. Like, if she's too mopey, I guess, I think people would disengage with the film. And if she's too over the top, people might find the film to be a bit campy in the way that they find Mommie Dearest to be campy. But she plays this role with kind of the perfect amount of restraint. Like, when she's taking this abuse, she's not crying, she's not screaming, she's kind of just taking it. And in a lot of ways, this film is really sympathetic to the fact that a housewife is actually a difficult job, because, at this time and in the decade before it, people thought very little of housewives. What do they do for work, right? They don't work. The husband's the breadwinner, right? But this film shows that that's actually a difficult lifestyle, and that, even though she's having an affair, you don't blame her in a lot of ways, because she's a human, and she needs, it's a film that humanizes a housewife, makes them the center of the story. And I just found it to be, like a lot of his other films, I found it to be this kind of interesting twist on the conventions of Hollywood at the time. So I really liked this movie. I really connected with it a lot. It's also a Christmas film, which I love Christmas films, especially films that kind of take place at Christmas but aren't, you don't need to watch them at Christmas, because they're kind of just stories that take place at Christmas. It's fun. It kind of gets into the intricacies of being a housewife. And I'm not going to, a lot of this podcast, I'm going to try and be positive about every film that I talk about, and I don't want to, like, kind of hate on other films and bring them down. But there's another film that is about a housewife called Jean Dielman, and it's considered the greatest film of all time to some people. And it also touches on how difficult it is to be a housewife, and how kind of lonely and monotonous that life is. And I just think this tells that same story much more effectively in a quarter of the runtime, because that film is like 4 hours. But anyway, again, I'm not trying to bring that film down to talk this film up. That would be kind of not super useful. But I just thought Diary of a Mad Housewife was really unique. And if you want to see kind of what being a housewife is like and kind of how that might not be what you thought it would be, then I would certainly recommend this film. But we're going to end with another film that is fully looking at the world through the lens of a woman, and that would be Play It As It Lays.
I could tell you I saw a cock in that ink blot, but why? I could give you a lot of answers, but none of them apply. Here are some typical questions the doctors here asked me. I'm to answer yes or no.
So Play It As It Lays is the other film that I've been alluding to a lot in this podcast as a film that completely lacks Frank Perry's touch, but is completely covered in someone else's touch, and that would be Joan Didion. And Joan Didion, if you don't know, she's this award-winning writer who like Frank Perry, she is very good at looking at counterculture and looking at the world from a very liberal, very feminist point of view, right? And so the essential plot of Play It As It Lays is we're following a woman who is she's been committed to a mental institution, so clearly that's a theme here. But instead of the film ending in the mental institution, it starts in the mental institution and it works its way backwards. So we see how she got there through this variety of terrible things that have happened to her, right? I mean, she's in a loveless marriage, and she's having an affair, and she has a gay best friend who is he's struggling a lot, and he's suicidal, and it just, her life is completely going wrong in so many ways, right? And it's interesting because, like Diary of a Mad Housewife, it's very sympathetic towards both women and also towards gay people, because we see her best friend. He's kind of the second main character in this film, and her best friend is played by Anthony Perkins, who that's actually of everything with this movie. I want to start there because I love that finally Anthony Perkins was given a role where he could be a homosexual man, because for so long in his career he was closeted, right? Or he was closeted for his entire career, and he's always playing the straight guy, but here he plays a gay guy, and I just thought that was it was nice because you get to see a side of Anthony Perkins that you don't see in other movies, and we actually have an Anthony Perkins movie in the next episode, so I just love Anthony Perkins. I think he's one of the 10 or so best actors of all time. I think he just absolutely kills every film he's in. Obviously he's most well known for Norman Bates, which I think that makes that our second Psycho reference this episode. So anyway, he's a great character in the film, but Tuesday Weld is kind of the lifeblood of the film. She plays Mariah. It's spelled Maria, but it's pronounced Mariah. And she's an actress. She's trying to make ends meet in Hollywood, and that's difficult. And again, to give another Tarantino reference, he's someone I keep mentioning a lot too. It's very clear that Tarantino loves this film, and it was a very large influence on Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Second time I'm mentioning that film, because this has the kind of same aesthetic that Once Upon a Time in Hollywood has, which is like sun-cracked Los Angeles, the kind of the pastel Los Angeles of the 1960s. But I think cinematography-wise, this is a great film. Performances-wise, this is a great film. The writing, though, and I'm not going to hate on Joan Didion because she wrote some great films, and she certainly was a very strong writer. But the writing here is kind of what I would call, I'm 15 and here's what I just learned about the world, because it's like, it's not as deep as it thinks it is, right? It's telling this somewhat, it's kind of the same story of Diary of a Mad Housewife, which is, it sucks to be a woman, but it's telling it in a way that is like, let's confuse the audience as much as possible. Let's make this experimental. Let's have time jumps. Let's have long, pretentious conversations about the state of the world, and let's let everyone know how much smarter we are than they are. And I think Joan Didion, she wrote some great stuff. She wrote The Star Is Born in the 70s, which was the Barbra Streisand one. She wrote The Panic in Needle Park. I think The Panic in Needle Park is a great movie. I almost saw that with Al Pacino introducing it, but I had to miss that, unfortunately. But in a lot of ways, people consider this her masterpiece. People consider this her best screenplay, and I don't see it. Without delving into spoilers, there's a suicide in this film, and the way it's shot and the way it takes place, it's so clear that it's like trying to be deep and trying to be powerful and trying to say something important, but I think it comes across as misguided and it comes across as insensitive and like amateur, and in a lot of ways, Play It As It Lays was one of my least favorite films of this bunch, just because if there's one thing that I really struggle to connect with, it's experimental films. And it's one of the reasons I'm glad that this film is included in the book, and why there's other experimental films that I'm glad are included, because I believe very strongly in never closing your mind to any any type of film. I watch romances, I watch horror, I watch animated films, I watch documentaries, and there's so much to be gained from every genre, but I think that experimental films never fully connect with me, because I struggle to see why it couldn't be told conventionally, and how that it might not be a better movie if it's told conventionally. But look, this is my own pitfalls, right? If you're hearing me talk about this and you love the idea of sun-drenched Los Angeles in the 60s, and you love experimental films, and you love films that were written by women that are extremely forward thinking, I think you might really care for this film. You might really like it. And if you want to see Anthony Perkins in a role where he is playing a gay man, then totally check this out, because this is Anthony Perkins at his most unrestricted, and I love that. And so I think this is a good double feature. If you're watching these films in the double features that I'm telling you to watch them in, or suggesting, not telling you, but this would be a really fun one, because it's literally the same exact theme, right? It's the same concept, the same story, but they're told by two different women, Eleanor Perry and Joan Didion. And I'll say I think Eleanor Perry really nails it a much better way than Joan Didion. But both films are good. Both films are good in their own ways. And honestly, I'm really glad that we got 8 Frank Perry films in this book, because I think they're all 8 messy, they're all 8 interesting, they're all 8 not films that you are hearing about in the cultural conversation. And so I'd say check them all out. I think that this journey as we go through it is going to be full of so many varied films, and I really hope you enjoy as we go through them. The first episode got some great feedback, so I really appreciate it. If you have any more feedback on this episode, I'd love to hear it. I'd love to hear which of these films you've seen, which ones you care for, and which ones maybe I've convinced you to check out. I don't know if I've convinced anyone of anything, but hopefully I've convinced you to check out Rancho Deluxe or The Swimmer or Diary of a Mad Housewife or whatever else. So let me know. Again, we're going to be back in 2 weeks, I think, for episode 3, which episode 3 we're going to cover 9 films, and I'm going to be joined by a special guest in that episode, and I'm not going to spoil anything else right now other than to say, if you like the show, please make sure to give it a like, subscribe to this YouTube channel, or subscribe to this podcast if you're listening to it on a podcast platform. But I think this has been a really fun journey so far. We're now 13 films in, which means we have 4,297 to go or something like that, or 4,190. I don't know what I just said, but anyway, we still have many more films to discuss, many films to go, and I hope you'll enjoy coming along on this ride with me, because we're going to be talking about some fun movies next episode, and I'm really excited. So thanks for watching, and until the next time, I'll see you at the movies.